Hello. Welcome to our presentation of Guess Who's Not Coming to Dinner. Since the death of George Floyd, we have been collaborating on an art project with Black Lives Matter and what it means to us. We hope our project will inspire you in more ways to understand what the loss that black families have to deal with due to racial inequalities. We've set this table for our guests, but those guests won't be coming to dinner because they are no longer with us. Each place setting represents who we've lost due to systematic racism. Each plate represents how long a guest was allowed to live before their lives were taken. As we visit each plate, we will learn what our guests did and why they will not be able to join us tonight. We'll start with the first plate, which represents a full average life for a U.S. citizen. The average lifespan for a U.S. citizen is 78.5 years. During this time, many events occur for a full life. The clock on the plate represents time and events that happen over time. Our guests will never reach these milestones. Many life events are represented on the plate, such as learning how to ride a bike, high school graduation, marriage, moving into your own home, having children, working, vacationing, and retirement. Each plate setting has a partial plate showing how our guest was not able to live out their 78.5 years. Trayvon Martin, a 17-year-old high school student, took a trip to his local convenience store but did not return home. A 911 call was placed by a man who would later be known by the name of George Zimmerman. He saw Mr. Martin as a threat because of what he was wearing and by the color of his skin. He was shot one time and the bullet pierced his heart and lung. There he laid face down in the grass, lifeless. This is why we made Trayvon Martin a serving tray. Trayvon wasn't here to refute anything that was said. How fair is that trial? I see kids wearing hoodies all the time. Should I call the police every time I see someone in my neighborhood with a hoodie? Is this a sign of profiling? Michael Brown, an average 18-year-old, just graduated high school and was enrolled and ready to attend college. Friends and colleagues closest to him have described him to be a gentle giant. He was an unarmed suspect of petty larceny and was gunned down by a white officer in the street. He was shot 8 times and laid there in his own pool of blood for 4 hours. He also would be invited to our dinner party and would receive a serving tray, but cannot attend. Dontre Hamilton was a 31-year-old man with a non-violent mental health history. As he lay resting peacefully in a park, 911 received multiple calls about a suspicious man sleeping on a park bench. Officers responded and declared there was nothing illegal or suspicious at the scene and left. It was then another officer arrived and heightened the situation, which eventually led to the officer shooting him, an unarmed man, 14 times, killing him. For this reason is why we have made Mr. Hamilton a serving tray. Does your loved one deserve to be gunned down 14 times for laying on a park bench? Eric Gardner was a 43-year-old man, a father, and a husband. The day he was killed, officers responded to a call about a fight that had broken out that Mr. Gardner himself had reportedly broken up. Words were exchanged between the officers and Mr. Gardner, about the selling of his cigarettes, which led to one of the officers using excessive and illegal force, placing him into a chokehold and killing him. That day, the only thing he was guilty of was selling illegal cigarettes. He died outside, on the ground in public view, by men who were sworn to protect him. He was unarmed and screaming, "I cannot breathe." This is why we have decided to invite Mr. Gardner to dinner and have prepared him a dinner tray. Does your loved one deserve to die for selling Lucy's? Ezzo Ford was a 25-year-old man at the time of his death. He was walking in his own neighborhood where he lived the majority of his life and was profiled by the LAPD and was part of an investigative stop. On LAPD accounts, they say he looked as if he was armed and dangerous and possibly stashed drugs in the bushes near him. They say he attacked them and reached for one of the officers' guns while tussling with one of them on the ground. That's when they decided to use deadly force. On multiple civilian eyewitness accounts, he was compliant with all the officers and even had his hands in the air when he was tackled and shot 3 times. Both officers had tasers, which they had left in the car. The total time lapse from the officers leaving their vehicles to the first moment when Mr. Ford was shot was 13 seconds. For this is why we have made a dinner tray for Mr. Ford. Breonna Taylor, 26 years old, a public servant as an EMT and an aspiring nurse, shot in her own home 8 times after being abruptly awakened by police. She and her boyfriend were sleeping and heard multiple loud bangs at the door. There was no announcement as to who it was, and they assumed the worst. Breonna's boyfriend thought it was someone there to harm them, so he fired 1 shot to scare the intruders away, defending themselves and their home, and in return had her apartment sprayed with blind bullets. At least 22 rounds. All of her neighbors said they never heard anyone announce themselves, and to make matters worse, no drugs or any illegal paraphernalia was found at her residence. Breonna was alive for up to 5 minutes, gasping for air, probably trying to make sense of what happened before her death. And this is why we made Breonna a serving tray. We have also made Breonna Taylor an additional serving tray due to being a public servant. Couldn't this have been handled during the daytime? No knock search warrants are now declared illegal where she lives and was named Breonna's Law. Ahmaud Arbery was a 25-year-old man who was followed and shot dead while jogging in Glenn County, Georgia. Mr. Arbery was not armed at the time of his murder and was thought to have been the source of neighborhood break-ins per his assailants. Gregory McMichael saw Mr. Arbery jogging and called for his son Travis to assist him. Both got into a pickup truck with loaded weapons and went after him. They soon caught up to him, and when exiting their vehicle, they had their weapons in hand and a scuffle began. Mr. Arbery was shot 3 times and died at the scene. Gregory McMichael, a retired officer and investigator, tried to cover up his actions and the actions of his son using his former credentials. He urged the district attorney's office and the police department not to make any arrests regarding the killing of Mr. Ahmaud Arbery. The case went through 3 district attorneys who recused themselves from the case because of ties with the McMichael family. It took 10 weeks for the police department to make an arrest. This is why we have made Mr. Arbery a place at our table. He will also be receiving a serving tray. They could have just called the police department. Instead, they took matters into their own hands. Laquan McDonald, a 17-year-old teenager from Chicago, Illinois, was gunned down by the ones who swore an oath to protect him and its citizens. In many cases around the world, armed suspects of various incidents are arrested without issue or minor implications. This cannot be said for Mr. McDonald. According to the CPD, Mr. McDonald was acting erratic. He had a knife in his hand, slashing tires, breaking windows, and just seemed out of sorts and dangerous. Law enforcement had every right to intervene, but what came next was unjust. Officer Jason Van Dyke arrived to the scene to try to assume control of the situation, but with force and demands. When Mr. McDonald did not adhere to his demands, he was shot. At first, his homicide was ruled as a justifiable homicide until 13 months later, a judge ordered the city to release the police dash cam video, which led to the arrest of Officer Van Dyke the same day, and he was charged with homicide. The video showed Officer Van Dyke arriving to the scene, and within seconds of arriving, he began to shoot. He shot Mr. McDonald in the back as he was turned away from him, and while he lay bleeding on the ground, limp, he shot him again 15 more times. During his trial, a series of cover-ups were uncovered, police statements were fabricated, and some were even disposed of without notice. This is why we have decided to invite Mr. Laquan McDonald to our dinner party. Does your loved one deserve to get shot in the back? George Floyd was a 46-year-old man killed by an officer in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He was a father and a son to whom he cried out to during his death. The only thing he was guilty of was possibly using a counterfeit $20 bill at a local convenience store. When officers arrived, they confronted Mr. Floyd, at which a heated verbal exchange was made, and he was ultimately handcuffed. Mr. Floyd struggled with his arrest, maintaining his innocence, which made the officers use more force to gain control. But there's a difference between force and too much force with negligence. Mr. Floyd's autopsy report showed he died from cardiopulmonary arrest implicating law enforcement's subdual, restraint, and neck compression, which means his heart stopped while and due to restraint by law enforcement and constricting of his neck. We are still unsure to this day if in fact the $20 bill was actually fake. But does your loved one deserve to die over a counterfeit $20 bill? There were onlookers and 4 officers at the scene. The onlookers were begging the officers to back off Mr. Floyd as he lay there screaming, "I can't breathe." Officer Derek Chauvin ignored Mr. Floyd's request and kept his knee placed on Mr. Floyd's neck. Mr. Floyd died there, on the cold ground, begging for his life. And this is why we have chosen to invite Mr. Floyd to our dinner party. And he also will be receiving a spot at our table. Tamir Rice was an innocent 12-year-old boy, African American, from Cleveland, Ohio. The only thing I believe Mr. Rice was guilty of was being a child. He was shot by officers responding to a call of someone with a firearm at a local recreation center, pointing it at random people. The caller also specified that he believes the firearm was fake and that the person holding it was a juvenile. When officers arrived to the scene, they saw young Mr. Rice and instructed him to put his hands up. During which time, instead of putting his hands up, it looked as if he was trying to relinquish his toy from his waist and was shot 1 time in the torso. The firearm turned out to be fake, and the officer who shot him stayed on the force for a few more years and was only fired when it was discovered that he withheld previous employment information. This is why Mr. Rice was invited to our dinner party. Does your child deserve to be shot and gunned down for holding a toy gun? Rashard Brooks was a 27-year-old man living in Atlanta, Georgia at the time of his death. He was a father, a son, and a husband. The day of his death, an officer responded to a call of a man asleep in his car, blocking a fast food drive-thru. Officer Bozeman approached the vehicle of Mr. Brooks and called for assistance, and Officer Wolf arrived. Officer Wolf conducted a breathalyzer exam, and he and Officer Bozeman began to arrest him, and a scuffle began. Mr. Brooks took control of the officer's taser and began to run. According to reports, the distance between the officer and the suspect was too great for the taser to do any effect on the officer, and any skilled officer would have known that. As Mr. Brooks ran, Officer Wolf decided to take out his concealed weapon and shoot Mr. Brooks in the back. The use of the officer's weapon was not justified and was reckless, as the officer shot 3 shots, with 2 hitting Mr. Brooks. 1 also hit an occupied car. Mr. Brooks posed no deadly threat to anyone and could have been arrested and taken to jail, but instead he was killed due to bad judgment from the officer. Mr. Brooks was invited to our dinner party and will be receiving a serving tray as well. Some of these cases, people have been quoted to say, "I can't breathe." I can't breathe means just that. I can't breathe. It can also mean other parts of their body can be damaged or affected at the same time. We have lost all of these people. Their loss also affects their families. A loss of one person means a loss for our community. Say their names: Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Dontre Hamilton, Eric Gardner, Ezzo Ford, Breonna Taylor, Armand Arbery, Laquan McDonald, George Floyd, Tamir Rice, and countless others were cheated out of their 78.5 years of life. Because of racism and our justice system being flawed in favor of white people with power, and with the least favored, African Americans, were always viewed as less than. Somehow, someway, law enforcement all over the world have apprehended criminals and suspects of various crimes, with some being very serious, such as mass murder, without a scratch. No one should die for an alleged counterfeit $20 bill while jogging, holding a toy gun, or sleeping on a park bench. When we say Black Lives Matter, it is because people of color died when they should have been here today. The justice system failed us, failed them. This should shed light on systemic racism. Would you agree? We have paid over $20 million and counting to families who've had lost their loved ones' lives due to systemic racism, bad judgment, and some just because they were black. Wouldn't your tax dollars be better put to use on mental health awareness, schools? Thank you. Say their names. All Black Lives Matter.